watching me take photos of the only recognizable area in my childhood hometown with a Canon FD 20-35mm f3.5 bell mounted onto my Fujifilm X-T3 with a Metabone speed booster while I was deciding on whether or not to make this particular video earlier this week. Now, it's no secret that vintage lenses generally can't stand up to the latest and greatest in terms of sharpness and autofocus speed, especially ones that have no autofocus. But they are cheap, and they do have character that was built into their design rather than a side effect of loose tolerances and cut corners when today's lens manufacturers tout them as a feature. We know what you're doing, guys. Come on. Now, the concept isn't anything new, but it is rising in popularity, especially with new photographers, due to the rising cost of new equipment and the supply issues that keep old equipment prices high on the secondhand market. Looking at you, Fujifilm. This has definitely hit the film space pretty hard as well, but thankfully the sheer number of lenses made back then have kept lens prices pretty reasonable, at least by today's standards. A subscriber named Lena shot me a message on Instagram after watching my most recent XT200 video that I'll link in a card above right over here. Strongly recommend you check it out, it's a fun video. And she said that she's tired of paying for film and development, which is very fair. Now, I started off shooting with the Canon 70D years ago and only dabbled in film a bit since the lockdown days, mostly because I already own Canon FD lenses that I adapted to my Fuji X-T3 for video work since, well, I'm not made of money. I didn't shoot too many rolls over the years because by the time I'd buy the film and have it processed, I'd be $50 deep in for 36 photos at best. There was an important lesson in shooting those rolls though, and that it finally got me to slow down and compose my shots properly so that almost every shot was a keeper, rather than taking a few hundred shots and culling them down to about the same number of winners after a session. Now, I personally blame shooting sports for so many years for getting me into that habit, but that's not very important right now. Back to the DM, I found out she shot with a Canon FD mount camera and lenses and asked about mounting them to the XT200. I recommended at that point that she go with a different camera like an X-T2 or an X-T3 if that was the route that she was going to go with, since the ergonomics are just better. And then I remembered that that's actually what I did for a few years in the past, and that is the story behind why today's video even exists. So on that note, like this video and subscribe, and don't be afraid to ask a question in the comments. If anything, I'll answer them in the next video, and if possible, I can even potentially make a whole other video answering that question because I generally do enjoy doing this stuff. Okay, I'm going to keep the technical part of this simple, and you can skip over to this timestamp right here if knowing how these different adapters work maybe isn't your thing. But I'd recommend at least coming back to this so you know how each option and combination affects your choice of lens and the camera body that you're mounting it to before you spend any money. The ways you're going to end up mounting lenses from one camera system or lens mount to another is going to be through either a lens mount adapter, a focal reducer, which is more commonly known as the speed booster, that's the term you're probably familiar with, and the considerably less common focal expander, which is how typically you get full frame lenses onto medium format cameras, and it effectively operates the opposite of a speed booster. Maybe someday I'll make a video on that. I don't think anyone watching this right now is too concerned about that process at all. Although it does make me wonder if something like that exists for APS-C to full frame, but that's probably just... Let's move on. So how do these work? A lens mount adapter will swap one mount to another, bringing the flange and the sensor as close to OEM spec to one another as possible, meaning that the rear element and the sensor have the same space as an OEM lens mounted on. I could probably phrase that better, but I think you get the idea. The most common iteration of that nowadays are the EF to RF adapters for Canon and the FTZ adapters for Nikon. Those are the same brands, so they retain a lot of OEM functionality through the electronics there, and the autofocus is generally pretty good between them. You'll just have some image quality loss only because the older sensors don't resolve as well as the newer ones, but that's a whole other topic. Now, some more expensive adapters will do the same thing for mounting different brands of lenses onto different camera bodies, often with results that work well enough for photos and kind of iffy for continuous autofocus, but yeah, it's alright. But if you're switching camera systems or trying to fill gaps in the current camera ecosystem that your part of has, which, by the way, there's a whole community of Fujifilm wildlife photographers that adapt Nikon F-mount super telephoto primes onto their cameras, and they love it. They say that it's great. But that's one example. Typically, like these adapters, they're the only option you have to do that, to bridge that gap. It's not terrible, but it's not OEM. So you can expect some hunting for the autofocus enabled adapters and full-time use of your camera's focus peaking features if you're using a manual variant. Now, speed boosters are where things get fun and sometimes a little more expensive. Speed boosters are actually called focal reducers because they reduce the field of view and the aperture of the lens that you're mounting by 0.71. Although I've seen some, for some reason, that were 0.79 magnification. I have no idea why, but the majority of them are 0.71 magnification. You tend to see marketing materials around them that state things like, this will make your crop sensor camera full frame, or some iteration of that statement for the most part. And that's not quite true, but it's also not exactly a lie. You end up with around a 1.1x crop factor instead of a 1.5x, a little more for the Canons. I think Canons are 1.6x on the crop factor. And you gain a full stop of light as well. This is all before you mount that lens onto your crop sensor camera and then apply that same 1.5x crop factor onto this new lens. There's some confusion surrounding this online every now and then, but the gist of it is that the changes apply to the lens before mounting it to your camera, and then things are business as usual. Like if you're mounting a full frame to an APS-C, it's like all the same principles apply. For this video, I opted to just stick to the Canon FD 20-35 f3.5L, I keep saying the full name, onto the X-T3 with the Metabone speed booster that I've been using for a few years now. The speed booster has a magnification, like I said, of 0.71, so you'd multiply all the numbers on this thing by 0.71. This now makes the lens a 14.2 to 24.85 millimeter f2.5 lens. I'm only giving really specific readings because I know what the comments will look like if I just call it a 14 to 25, so if you're gonna get specific in the comments, like, relax. Or go ahead and comment, and thanks for the engagement. Everyone still with me? Good. Now, when you mount this onto a crop sensor camera, which in my case, again, is the Fuji X-T3, you apply the 1.5x crop factor, and the effective focal length, or focal range rather, becomes 21.3 to 37.3, and the aperture remains at f2.4 point something. I just call it 2.5 to make it simplified, but with the crop factor applied, it'll render like an f3.75 lens, which, you know, doesn't exist, but you get the idea, and that's pretty close to the original 3.5 aperture of the lens itself. So you get, again, something in the range of a 1.1x crop overall from the original specs of the lens, give or take, but you get the idea. We're done with the technical bits. Now, I know not everyone likes them, but I know exactly what the comments are going to devolve into if I don't address them in this video, especially since I'm using a speed booster instead of an adapter. And if you're still watching this video at this point, go ahead and like and subscribe, because it means you have the same dysfunctions around camera equipment than I do, and we would probably make really good friends. Now, getting into actually using the camera, I went to a local park and hoofed it for a bit with a 20-35 mounted onto the X-T3, which I feel like I've said 1,000 times at this point in the video, but disregard. With a wide open or stop down, you can see the lack of clinical precision in these lenses, along with some noticeable fringing if you take a closer look when I punch into the photos. But if you look at the image as just an image, you can see the nostalgic rendering of years past, making it clear that the coding and manufacturing of the lenses of yesteryear were a pretty big part of giving photos that vintage or timeless look that we all associate with film photos nowadays, not just the film stock being used. Also, as a quick note, all of these are shot on the standard Provira film simulation, and you've probably guessed that yes, I do have focus peaking on. That's what those like crazy blue lines are everywhere. Just to make sure every image I was taking was going to be relatively sharp, whether or not I did the half press on the shutter to turn it off and fine tune everything, which I always recommend when you're using focus peaking. The perks of mounting this lens onto an X-T3 are that you can flip between your favorite film simulations, or you can make your own if you feel so inclined. Most of these only have some small exposure edits and some boosted blues that you'll see transition 2 seconds into each shot if I did edit the shot. But the base photos are there with no adjustments whatsoever for the JPEG shooters among us, just so you see what you're getting into right when you say, like, you just pick up the camera and you make no adjustment settings whatsoever. You just toss on one of your old FD lenses. This is generally what it looks like if you're going to go to somewhere with the same color space like your local park. Shots of the tall grass give off that old film vibe. I included those only because I couldn't find a gas station with neon lights to throw into the mix while I was out shooting all this. The people overlooking the city of Patterson, which is where we're actually going to be wrapping up this video. And that's what really starts selling a setup like this to me for photos, because I look at it and it looks like a memory of a place I've been to. Maybe in 20 years, a Gen Alpha YouTuber will be making a video on shooting their hometown on a vintage iPhone 15 and say the same thing when they look at those photos. The ice cream trucks were of particular interest. I really did enjoy shooting those. The colors are fun and are meant to be out of place. a thought I really wouldn't have had if I were doing a walk around with any of my standard Fuji lenses. I went down the hill and found the other one that's always parked there, with a little more forgiving light on one side and the bubble machine going full bore. I regret not spending a little more time here to get one of those bubbles, like right in front of the lens, but I was losing light fast, and even with the speed booster, this isn't exactly a fast lens to begin with, so, you know, plus I still had to get my steps in. I found plenty of deer along the way, but with no one to take portraits of for these sample photos, they became my subjects. I've got an 85mm Canon FD 1.2 well that could potentially be worth another video if I find a willing photo subject. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you want me to look into. You'd have to pixel peep to really see it, but the extra glass sandwich between the lens and camera body does seem to introduce a little bit of purple fringing as well. Interestingly enough, and it is kind of hard to see on screen, but Canons typically tend to lean more towards magenta and Fuji tends to lean more towards green. But in the unedited photos, the magenta really does come through, especially on the whites. Now this is in no way like a bad thing and it's an easy fix and post if you don't want it, but it's just not something I've ever noticed with standard Fuji glass. Although again, I've never really had to stop and think about a shot, focus manually, take the shot, then take a look at the photo to see if I'm happy with it or not. At least not for what I personally consider to be throwaway photos. The experience overall was pretty calming. The camera, of course, paired perfectly with the lens as it was paired with a very familiar setup. I had my shutter speed dial with the bonus of having an ISO dial, ISO for the classy among us. No pulling or pushing in development needed here. I always hated the nonsense surrounding the Fujifilm cameras when people would talk about them being magical, or the images looking filmic, or anything like that. It's a magnesium alloy casing with a bunch of cobalt and silicon making things run. There's nothing magical or ethereal about the equipment itself, but the experience is likely why I still keep Fujifilm equipment for my own personal use, despite the commercial equipment I have for client work. And pairing it with these old lenses for photos has been the first thing to really augment the walk around shooting experience for me in years. We're gonna wrap things up by visiting Main Street in Paterson, New Jersey, better known as Palestine Way, as the street has loads of Palestinian-owned shops and restaurants, and honestly this was like the only thing I missed about Jersey while I was down living in DC for the past decade. And family, of course, yeah, I did miss my family, in case any of them are watching. Taking a look at the little Palestine sign, you can see what the background separation looks like, along with the zoom range between these two particular shots. Not bad for a walk-around lens that costs the same price as a few cups of coffee. It was also while I was taking photos of this Alhamdulillah graffiti that was done with the shop owner's permission, I asked, that I realized I definitely needed a haircut, so that's why the talking head videos like this. It feels weird. I like my longer hair, but it gets messy fast, especially when I'm outdoors. Wrapping up this photo walk along with my final thoughts on a setup like this for folks, I say that it's exactly what you'd expect. The photos are photos, and if you're looking to take these for yourself, you and your wallet would probably be pretty happy with the decision you made. There are drawbacks, of course. The big one for me is that setups like this are not weather sealed, regardless of what it is you're using. I don't know of a speed booster that is weather sealed, and I'm very much an outdoorsy guy who needs weather sealing for when I'm inevitably caught in downpour. This XC3 has been with me since it launched back in 2018, and it's been through all the elements the northeastern United States has to offer without issue, other than occasionally needing to clean out the dials a little bit with some dental floss, which, by the way, like if you have this camera and the dials are sticky, just use dental floss. It'll save you a ton of money. Obviously, you don't have any autofocus, and some lenses will be too soft with the setup when shooting wide open. Not an issue with video, because typically softer video is perfectly fine, but trying to manually focus that Canon 85-1.2 wide open on a close subject for a portrait with a speed booster, that's a precision sport, especially since the lens, when you mount it on, has like an f/0.85 aperture. That being said, would I recommend it over getting a film camera? Yeah, for most people. Sure, you can keep an old Canon AE1 or f1 alongside this setup and share lenses, both to keep costs down and practicality up. I'm also a big fan of using old equipment instead of buying the latest and greatest and contributing to a wasteland of electronics and the horrible to downright evil lengths companies will go to when it comes to sourcing precious metals for our little playthings. No child in the Congo or Afghanistan should have a gun pointed at them to provide us with autofocus algorithms that are 0.001% better in benchmark tests. But that's a whole other video in and of itself. I'm open to making more videos on things like this. I've got an EF to Fuji X speed booster and a handful of EF glass left if anyone wants to see that. along with way too much gear that I've accumulated over the past decade. Let's talk about that and more in the comments below, and with that being said, catch you at the next one.